Okay, so last time we were talking about NodeExpress middleware, kind of leaving off on this particular slide here. Um, well, not on this particular slide, but as a quick recap, we talked about the concept of middleware. We talked about what traditional structural middleware was, and then we talked about the concept of middleware in Express. And again, simplest way to remember middleware in Express is because it's in the middle of the rendering, or what is often considered the request processing pipeline, right in the middle, right? That's what we talked about. Um, and this is an example of something called the decorator pattern, which you can look up and again, the Gang of Four book, a way to decorate or dynamically add new functionality. It was also called in the earlier one an interceptor pattern because these are intercepting the request along that pipeline. Either way, example of kind of enhanced design pattern introduced in the middle of our MVC. I should probably expand the screen like I like to do here. Maybe that'll look a little better. Don't do that. And now let me get rid of this stuff to make sure because now it's off. Okay, so anyway, that's what middleware is. We had a very contrived, simple example last time. I actually souped up this example a little bit and pushed it back into our GitHub repo to show you a few extra features, add a few comments on it. The first is keep in mind when you're doing the middleware part, this is your mandatory signature of the callback, meaning you have to have this next here, and that next has to be bound to, all right, a function of some kind. And then you invoke the function as the last thing that you do at the end. Now, actually, that's a get. But we have that on our, as we set up our chain, first is we call our chain in order, right? So the order in which we assign the uses is the order of this processing pipeline, all right? That's the order. So if you want one to come first, you put it first in the assignment. Now the other thing though is I tweaked this example from last time, and I added a filter on here. So you can notice how this one doesn't, this one doesn't. There is an optional first parameter that is the path. So I can even bind that interceptor, that I can bind that function into a place on that path, if you will, by putting in that particular. Now, if I don't have it like down here, then the default path is slash. All right. Another pattern, by the way, now I think about it, I call this a decorator pattern. I talked about it being an interceptor. It's also structurally kind of what's called a chain of responsibility path. Again, this notion of each each function intercepting the call, doing its own responsibility, and then passing it off to the next one. Okay, so you got plenty of patterns going on here in this very simple code. If we actually execute this version, so this is in our listen 1.js. Okay, yep, I got it set up like that. So if I run that, and it's at 80, oops, and sorry, I'm trying to type with the digitizer pen in my hand, and then I go over to my browser where I was running something. I had a new tab up, and so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to localhost 8081 / okay, just to the root path. And what's going to happen here? Well, notice down at the bottom here, you can see the bottom of my window down here, that I only got the second and third app use calls out. I didn't get the first one because it was binding to that /foo, right? As you can see in the slide behind me over here. So if I add that in there, right, now I have all three of them. Notice how the first showed up this time, all right, right here. I was able to successfully add that filter on the path. Now, what if I wasn't doing / or foo, right? What happens? All right, well, I still got the second or third, so it did bind by default to whatever path. So the / is a global path handler, but I can filter again by specific paths that I want to apply the interceptor in order to get the full chain to show up. So I do have some very basic filtering and selectivity on that chain in case I don't want to apply the filter. I would just put those mapped under different endpoints or different URLs. Right. Get rid of some of that. Yes, okay, so that was that example again, but just to show you that little wrinkle. But we kind of, well, I also added a couple extra that, again, you can look up. There's a lot of installable modules that come across with Express. I actually added these two in here, query and static. So you can serve static files instead of the old-fashioned way we did with the HTTP module. And you can also have a nice convenience, very commonly used middleware is the query one, which basically automatically takes your query string and turns it into a JavaScript object. So, if you have, name equals Joe and surname, equals Girardi, then you could access that using your dot syntax kind of thing on the query object, request.query.name, and you'd get back Joe and so forth. Again, I'm not going through all these different middlewares on here because those are all things you can readily look up the documents. You have to npm install them in addition to Express, but they're all very convenient and available for you to use to make your code even more convenient and more compact, if you will, rather than doing the long way like we've done in some of the earlier examples, so you understood everything that was going on. But two I do want to talk about real quick are the cookie parser and the express session logic, because those are relevant to two different forms of state that we had talked about before, right? So we had talked about cookies being, right, remember this was for personal state, or as I call it, or I call it user profile state, a way of tracking things. Again, cookies are stored in the browser, okay? But the way we were dealing with them in the HTTP module is we did an explicit set of the header. Remember the header set cookie that you had to do. All right. Well, as a convenience API, Node is going to give us some nice, simple ways of doing things. For example, on the wrapper response object inside of Express, I'm going to have response.cookie, and I give it a name and I give it a value. So I don't have to write out the string under the set cookie value. Now I can just indicate and say response.cookie, right, and with a name value pair, and I'm done. All right. If I want to clear the cookie, right, if clearing the cookie before involved us setting an expires on it, right, and an empty value. We again had to manually go in and set our cookie to essentially an empty value so that the browser would clean it up when it saw it and clear out its cookie cache, even though you couldn't guarantee that that would happen. Here, now we have a convenience API method. We don't have to stringify and set our response headers like that the long way. I should have noticed or noted up here the require cookie parser is what you require, and you can inject that right into your app.use as part of the middleware. To read a cookie value, just use the property syntax. So when you want to get one of your cookies with a particular name, right up here we are setting foo, right? So it would evaluate back and return as an expression the value of that property. That's on the ensuing request. Right, and that's it. It's as simple as that. It's a very convenient API. Gets us away from the long way of dealing with cookies. If you actually look at a very simple example, the Express cookies example, you see here's your require of the cookie parser. There's your app use of the cookie parser. Again, we got to do app use, so we are setting up our middleware to say, okay, I want to parse cookies after I do any kind of get operation. So I do the get operation, I send the cookie, and I've injected the cookie parser in the middle. Notice what this does in here. It's going to check for a has visited, and if it hasn't been set, it's going to turn around and set it on the response, so you'll see it the next time. So if we actually stop this one and run node express cookies. Very simple example. We'll go to port 8081 over here, and notice that, well, I have my an older cookie in here. This one I don't need, but I have the has visited one, right? Because I was setting the cookie and the browser accepted it. All right, and you can see that again. I'll remove I hit session cookies. I'm going to remove all the cookies. All right, and I'll hit that again. All right, and you'll see that cookie set again. In fact, you can see down here the cookies that are being echoed out each time. Okay. Okay, so that's it. I mean, cookies are literally that easy in Express as part of the cookie middleware. They have the usual properties. So, I'm not showing the full set of options, but we talked about before that cookies can have a relative path under which they apply, a maximum age indicating how long they should last by default their session, whether they can only be used over HTTPS in secure mode, the domain, prevent cross-domain cookie sharing and cookie stealing, whether it's only over HTTP, not the browser JavaScript. We talk about that property on cookies. Now there's an extra one. There's also a notion of signed. And just real quick, what's a signed cookie? And I'm not going to show a code example of this or anything, but effectively, when when we did this the first time, we had no parameter to the constructor. You can add a parameter to the constructor. We'll actually see it in the session example. You can add a parameter to the constructor that is a secret shared secret string. What that means is when you go and you send the cookie down to the browser from the server side via this call, all right, you indicate that the cookie should be signed. The cookie is signed via this secret. And what happens is when you get it back, when you get your cookie back, you've got to find it under the special one signed cookies. All right, so notice how the property here changed. It changed from request.cookies before to now request.signed cookies. So the signed cookies are partitioned out of the regular cookie structure into their own. And then on top of that, and that signing has to be evaluated back with your original secret. It's going to basically check that cookie was signed when it comes back to you, and because it's coming back to the same program that you signed it from, it's going to use the same secret in order to check that. So that way, you can kind of it's a very simple safeguard around checking if the cookie was tampered on the client. If it was and you don't get the same value back for the secret when it does its internal comparison, it will reject the cookie even though you have the right cookie name, and won't let you read it, so that way you're not reading an incorrect value. Maybe you're doing that then to store a session key like we saw. Well, we're going to talk about sessions in a minute. Maybe you're storing something though that where you want that safeguard. You want to know it's the user you're talking to. You want to know something about the user. You're personalizing your experience, and not doing something where somebody was basically trying to spoof the value of that cookie for some perhaps malicious result. A very simple mechanism. Again, I'd probably go a little bit more elaborate on obfuscating my cookies and running them over HTTPS than just rely on this mechanism, but it's a nice built-in mechanism. Okay, but doesn't fundamentally change what cookies are, what use case we use them for. Again, that's kind of the user profile, the personalization state that we talked about. Now, I also talked about before, but didn't show you code for, dealing with conversational state. All right. So what's our reminder? Conversational state. What is conversational state? That bounded interaction. Bounded, we can point to the stop, the start, and we can indicate the stop, like remember the shopping cart example. All right, we enter a workflow, we complete a workflow. We need to carry information from request to request until we complete the workflow. So we in fact have to add those stateful semantics, but since they are bounded, it's considered conversational state. It's state that is in transit between client and server, and we had a whole conversation on that, a whole set of notes on that. We discussed different strategies for doing conversational state, old school ways like hidden form fields, the use of cookies, but we talked about how that wasn't really the best use of cookies, rewriting URLs, piggybacking on SSL and HTTPS, and these kinds of things. We even showed a Java way of doing it. Well, Express is going to give us middleware to do that kind of conversational state session-oriented logic as well. Give us a structure by which we can pass information, kind of hang on to it as we go from page to page. Simple enough. Now, just like the Java servlet specification, the pattern here, if you remember, there's a slide I had in the state notes that talked about where do you put things on the client or on the server, right? And it talked about kind of the accepted way now is to use the cookie as an ID, or that essentially a hash key that's sent to the server so the server can look up your stateful information. That's how Node internally implements it. That's why you have to require the cookie parser middleware first. And again, you want to do that first in your use chain before you indicate that you want to use the middleware for sessions. And then there's some configuration options that you can do on a session. For the intents of this class, it's not important what goes in those options. You're going to be just fine with the default. All right. When your server receives its request, you're going to access the session off the request object using our dot syntax. What's going to be in the session are name value pairs, and you are going to basically access the property and get the value back. All right, and then you have a delete operator to indicate that you want to delete something out of that session. So as you go from page to page, there's some part of the conversation you want to have drop off. Now, even though the entire session is supposed to go away when you finish this bounded conversation, the whole thing's supposed to go away. It's still considered a best practice. And I didn't really talk about this before. It's still considered a best practice. Okay, let's say in this, you know what, I'm starting to write in my white space again, and I realize that in the middle, so I'm going to go back to our previous scribbles and start this again. If you remember, we talked about bounded interaction as starting on one side with like our browser and doing our page turning thing, right? We make a request up to the server, we go back to the browser, go up to the server, go back to the browser, and so forth. And what by page turning it means is we go from page to page, we're trying to keep track of and make it seem like each one of these browser loads are stateful. Right? Meaning what you've gotten back in the next browser page as you go from page to page depends on the previous page. That's the definition of stateful, right? But again, HTTP, right? Our HTTP protocol for the traffic going back and forth to the server isn't helping us out. So again, we've got to program it itself. We're putting a cookie ID down here. And up here, when we get that ID, we are using that as access into a big map full of data. The point being is the information that goes in this session structure, even though I may have several other page turns to go here before I finish, let's say, my shopping cart workflow, right? And this last one is finally checkout, and I terminate that bounded interaction between client and server, right? That's my bounded interaction, and I want to expire that. I may have entered some information during this part of the interaction back here that I don't need that information anymore going this way. So even though it'll get expired at the end, I don't have to wait for that. I can go ahead and delete an entry in my session object, delete a property on my session object, if you will, as soon as I'm done using it in this workflow. So it might have been some intermediate value that I no longer need and can go ahead and delete that property. All right, that's what the delete operator does. Okay, let's take a look at some code then. And the session example, where's this? Where's my session? There it is. Let me get rid of some of my scribbles again. This one's, you know, a little longer. All right. Now, there's also, you'll see in the comments here, there's this cookie session business. There's actually more than one middleware you can use for sessions. So you require a cookie session up here as well. But the Express session is a better implementation, so I'm going to stick with that one. But functionally, they'll be the same. You can actually swap in those lines and comment out the Express session ones, and you get the same exact functional result, although the nature of how the stateful information is passed back and forth would in fact change. Excuse me. Okay, so we require our Express, we require our cookie parser, we require our session part. All right, we indicate we want to use a cookie parser. We got to do that first. Right, the order of our use calls matters, and here we got to do that first before we go and do the session, because the session is expecting this guy, expects the cookie has already been parsed. We are putting a secret on it. That's one of the, this is an options. I told you you didn't really need the options, but there's the options. A resave meaning persist the cookie a little further, and save uninitialized. Once we get to our call, our functionality here, we're doing two gets, a get and a get here. So the first one's to library. Let's look at what happens. Just a console.log. it asks if there's a session property named restricted. All right. If there is, it prints out something about being in the restricted section before. If it isn't, it says basically welcome. You haven't been here before. All right. Now, if you go to the restricted section, which is under the route/restricted, it's going to go in and set the restricted property to true. This is a syntax to create that property, set it to true, and then it also sets a count. It checks whether or not the count's ever been set. If not, sets it to 1. Otherwise, increments it by 1, and then issues a redirect. This is nice too. Notice this redirect. This, as an aside, this is another convenience of Express, is I can just call a method redirect as opposed to going ahead and doing my set status to 301 or 302 and using the location header and all that stuff the long way. I can just say redirect, and boom, it's going to say redirect, go back to here. And next time I go in now, right? Now this is, think of the sequence here. First time we called this, second time we called that, but this is going to redirect. So this is going to wind up back in my browser, except for now I've set a property in the session of restricted, so now I should go to this one. All right, so I'm going to run it in just that order. I'm going to hit this one first and that one second, and what we should see is this come to my browser screen the first time and this come the second time. NodeExpress4MW2CookiesSession, and let's go over to the browser, and the first time we needed to hit /library. All right, welcome to the library. Now notice a couple things. First is, notice how we have the has visited cookie. All right, we still have it there because I'm still, I restarted the server, but I'm still going to the same domain. Right, I'm still going to localhost 8081, and I didn't restrict anything by path. And so even though I said has visited in my other Node application, it still stayed in the browser, and the browser's still going to send it on any request going up to localhost 8081. So that's why has visited is getting carried along here, if you will. But notice this new cookie, this connect SID. All right, connect SID, that's the internal cookie that the Express Session middleware uses. Notice how you have a nice obfuscated long key value that is, a hash value that is going to be real difficult to guess, right, and tamper with. So that's what gets sent back up. And now that session has been set, so now I can go up to, if I go to the restricted part, well, notice I typed in restricted, it redirected me to library. It still has the same cookie and everything, but notice how the message changed when I got redirected back to library. And again, that's because it noticed that I had set the session-oriented property down here on restricted, and I tested for it here. Not a shopping cart example, but a very simple example where I'm adding the stateful behavior in. That's what's stateful about this, right? What's stateful in this guy is I'm checking for some previous value that was set on some previous request. And so to be able to do that, the outcome depends on previous requests made, namely over here. So now I am all of a sudden stateful. Okay. This doesn't show you how to expire the cookie and so forth, but again, at some point, maybe I'd want to do a /clean or something like that, or /exit library, and I would want to clean out that cookie so I could start over again. Okay. But that's it. That's as simple as it is for sessions. You send them back and forth. But now obviously, when you want to get to doing richer shopping cart style information, this stuff that you're going to do your session logic with and go back and forth with is going to be a much richer set of properties. Maybe all the kinds of things you put in a shopping cart. The stuff that you want to buy and that's in the cart will be carried along inside that session. Again, that session goes from here to here. I should draw it that way. What goes down right to this way is we have a cookie that the browser is going to continue to send back to me, which will identify, oh yeah, this data structure is mine, and it has these items for, in my shopping cart or whatever. Again, whatever other state I'm deciding is part of my application. And again, I should remember to clean it out when I'm done with it, although our current example doesn't do that. It's as simple as doing that delete call showed down here. Okay, so to summarize, NodeExpress middleware. In a distributed component-based or service-oriented world, middleware suggests an additional layer or tier in a computational model. But in the NodeExpress functional paradigm, it is a functional expression of the request processing pipeline, as the injection or decoration of additional functions that are called along the way. All right, that's what we call the request processing pipeline. You also hear me sometimes call it the rendering pipeline. The rendering pipeline, frankly, the request processing pipeline is more appropriate because the request we're talking about here, this is the HTTP request, right? And we're going toward an HTTP response. That's a full pipeline. The term rendering processing pipeline or rendering pipeline refers to really the last part of the MVC pattern. We just deal with the view. And we go from taking our changed model of the world and rendering it on the glass in some format. So I should be more precise about that. Anyway, as an aside, not too big a deal for us. Notice that cookies are from HTTP. We talked about them before, but NodeExpress, nice, a convenient cookie parser module that allows us an easy convenience API to use. Sessions as well. Sessions also aren't for HTTP, right? We're stateless in HTTP, so Node was providing us the Express session, the cookie session, and frankly, again, you could actually go out to the NPM community and find a lot of different ways of implementing this session-oriented logic. All right, we're going to use Express Session here because it's easy. There's additional advanced features put on these things sometimes for performance optimization, for security. As part of this class, not really something relevant to us. I mentioned back before on the stateful notes that Java had this HTTP session object, and over in the Java Servlet standard, the specification of this API and its behavior and its implementation for containers in the component container model is standard in the sense of the Java community process. I only mention it over here because there isn't a standard in the Node community. Just the development community has a common understanding of what a session is. All right, it's just a common understanding of what it means to be session-oriented in your coding, and therefore there's a number of independent modules that you can use that are going to provide little variations on session-oriented logic. But there isn't a specification document I could point you to, like the servlet specification on the Java side, that would guarantee you certain things about sessions. And I mention that because, again, if you have to go at some point and make a design decision, an architectural decision about implementing sessions at your organization, read the Red Team Field Manual. I mean, RTFM, you've got to go read the documentation on what that module is providing. And I wouldn't, make any assumptions because they're not all going to be as swappable as it looks like in, oops, that's the wrong thing. Over here, when I commented out the cookie parser and said you can do cookie session or express session, well, what I'm saying is there's no contract there. That just happens to work in this example, but there's in fact no guarantee that would always be the case if you went and grabbed some other type of session-oriented middleware. All right. Again, I'm belaboring the point, but no standard to the middleware. No standard, but a common mind share, if you will, in the development community about what it means to be session-oriented, conversationally state-oriented in your development. All right. That kind of wraps up everything that we were going to do on the server side. We've run through a fair amount from the protocol up the way through to the binding of the protocol into a functional asynchronous programming model and why that's important. Then we got into higher order concepts like stateful programming and MVC, and then eventually into the middleware concepts so we could extend our processing pipeline. That again, some of that is node specific, but in general, that's what it is to be a server-side web development programmer, is to understand your stateful aspects, understand the HTTP protocol, understand the MVC design pattern, and then understand how you can extend or decorate that pattern in different ways. And even though we're going to do a particular programming assignment, I'm showing particular code in NodeExpress, All these concepts exist in any server-side web application framework, any server-side web development framework, regardless of the language that you use or the particular framework platform. You can have a raging debate about which one's better or worse on each one of these concepts for different reasons. But the fact of the matter is if you understand what these concepts mean in the context of server-side development, you can participate in that conversation and form your own opinions and decide what's right for your application, for your project team, for your organization, and its approach of what it needs to do for web application development. In the second half of the course, the next part of the course, when we switch to browser-based programming, some of these things will still come back. We'll still talk about the concept of state. We'll still talk about MVC. We'll still talk about functional and asynchronous programming and JavaScript and these kinds of things, but we'll be putting it in the context of browser-based coding. So I needed to cover the server side first because as we move things, it kind of follows the evolution of the web anyway. As we start to move functionality and code into the browser, we'll see the impacts it has on some of the assumptions we've been making, the nature of interaction between client and server and that back and forth diagram I'm drawing every time, how it stretches our pattern, and where it's good and where it's bad. Like everything's got a pro and con, so we'll talk about that and extend these concepts that we've been talking about as we go forward into that next part.